I'm Jerry Sittser. I teach theology at Whitworth University. You've probably all heard of the 7 deadly sins. It was something that carried over from the Middle Ages that people are familiar with today. The 7 deadly sins actually come from an idea that the early Christian period developed, largely through the influence of Evagrius Ponticus, a desert father who died in 399, and one of his disciples, John Cassian. Both of them left a print trail, but they didn't call it the 7 deadly sins. They called it thoughts. And it wasn't 7, it was 8, the 8 deadly thoughts. And they argued that it all begins in the mind, not in the will or human action. If we turn again and engage with that temptation and yield to the disturbance, it leads to a thought. Logismoi is the phrase, or thoughts. And these thoughts are not passing thoughts, they're thoughts that we actually engage with. Fantasy would be a word we could use, or imagination. The Desert Fathers, people like Evagrius Ponticus and Cassian, encouraged us to be able to think about these 8 deadly thoughts as diagnostic tools to understand what happens to the human soul that leads to darkness and to sin. And one of the disciplines they encouraged us to practice was to study our own thoughts. Where does the mind go? Well, there are 8 of these, as I said, and they're broken down into categories of 3, 3, and then 2. The first 3 have to do with some kind of external stimulation. Those would be gluttony, the temptation of food. John Cassian says that it could be that we think about food too much, we eat too much, or we fuss over food. There's lust, there is avarice, or the desire for things or money. Interesting, John Cassian says with avarice, the sin there is not wanting, it's never being satisfied in an insatiable appetite for more. Enough is never enough. The second 3 have to do with sins that are generated from within, although there may be external stimulation. That would be anger. The second would be sadness, peculiar in our minds. They're not just dealing here with sadness that we would translate as sorrow, but more sadness as dejection, extensive discouragement, even despair, and self-pity. It surfaces when we don't get what we want or think we deserve. And the third would be a term that most people don't even translate it. They call it akidia or asideia. And it has to do with listlessness or boredom or impatience with routine. Wanting to take shortcuts because we simply don't want to stay in a disciplined pattern of life long enough to be able to achieve results. The last 2 are the most damnable of all sins, or thoughts. That would be vainglory. Vainglory is wanting to be noticed or affirmed, always evaluating yourself according to public acclamation and attention. Pride is not caring what anybody thinks, including God. It's the sin that makes us God's direct competitor. But the end was to replace the thought and vice with a virtue. So hospitality, love, humility, and other things like that. And they did believe that over time, by the work of God's grace and by the practice of discipline and the desire for virtue, living a godly life, a life of purity of heart, as John Cassian said, we could actually see transformation in our lives.